There's a particular kind of confusion that does not have a clean name. It's not the confusion of being lost. That at least has a direction built into it, the sense that if you just keep moving, you will eventually arrive somewhere. This is a different kind. The confusion of standing exactly between two places, able to see both clearly, belonging fully to neither. The confusion of reaching for one identity and finding that your hand passes straight through it, reaching for the other and finding the same. This is the quiet psychological experience of Zillennials, the microgeneration born roughly between 1993 and 1998, too young to be fully millennial, too old to be fully Gen Z, occupying a cultural and developmental space that has no clean edges, no agreed-upon name, no shared mythology that belongs entirely to them. And if that sounds like a small thing, a generational label, a demographic detail, I want to suggest that it is not. Because the generation you grow up in is not just a date range. It is the world that shaped your nervous system, the economic conditions you absorbed before you had words for economics, the technology that rewired your relationship with reality, with attention, with connection, with yourself. The cultural mood that told you, quietly and constantly, what kind of person you were supposed to become. And for Zillennials, those signals came from two directions at once, often contradicting each other, often pulling in opposite ways. And the psychological weight of holding both, of being fluent in two worlds without being fully claimed by either, is something that has gone largely unexamined. Until now. Let us start with what it actually means to grow up in between. The oldest Zillennials were born in the early 1990s, which means they reached adolescence somewhere in the mid to late 2000s. This is a specific developmental window that carries enormous psychological significance, because adolescence is precisely when identity formation happens. It is the period psychologists call the identity versus role confusion stage. The years when a young person is supposed to be answering, consciously or unconsciously, the question, "Who am I?" And Zillennials were answering that question in a world that was changing faster than any previous generation had experienced. They remember the internet as a thing you went to, something you logged into on a family computer in the living room, something with a dial-up tone, something that felt like a destination rather than an environment. They remember Saturday morning cartoons and a childhood that was substantially analog. They played outside. They got lost without GPS. They experienced boredom, real boredom, the kind that requires you to generate your own internal world to fill the silence. And then, almost overnight, the world changed. Smartphones arrived. Social media arrived. The internet stopped being a destination and became the air. And Zillennials absorbed this transformation at a particularly vulnerable moment, old enough to remember what came before, young enough to be completely reshaped by what came after, old enough to have a before, young enough to have their formative years defined by the after. This dual experience, analog childhood, digital adolescence, created something psychologists are only beginning to understand. A generation with two distinct relationship frameworks for reality existing simultaneously inside the same nervous system. They can remember what it felt like to be bored without a screen to reach for. They can also not imagine navigating social life without one. They understand both the slowness of a world before constant connection and the anxiety of a world where disconnection feels like disappearance. They hold both. And holding both is not comfortable. It is, in a very specific psychological sense, a kind of low-grade dissonance that most of them have simply learned to carry without naming it. But the technology shift is only part of the story. There is a second layer, and it runs deeper. Zillennials came of age economically during one of the most destabilizing periods in recent history. The 2008 financial crisis hit when the oldest of them were just entering adulthood, just beginning to form their first real ideas about what economic life would look like for them. They watched the world their parents had promised, the one built on education, hard work, and reliable institutions, fracture in real time. But they were also young enough that the full cultural processing of that fracture, the millennial cynicism, the very specific generational grievance that millennials developed in response to broken promises, was not quite theirs either. They were close enough to feel the economic impact, but slightly too young to be part of the cultural conversation that formed around it. And then came Gen Z's response to the world. Darker, more ironic, more digitally native, less invested in traditional markers of success, and Zillennials found themselves, again, close but not quite, understanding it from the inside but not fully inhabiting it. This is the pattern that defines the Zillennial psychological experience, not belonging to one place or the other, understanding both from the inside, being shaped by both, and yet when the cultural conversation happens, when generations gather around their shared experiences and say, yes, this is who we are, finding themselves slightly outside the circle. There's a term in psychology called ambiguous loss. It was developed to describe the grief that comes from losing something that has no clear ending, a relationship that never formally closed, a future that was expected and then quietly disappeared, an identity that was promised and then revised. The grief is real, but there is nothing specific to point to, no clear moment of loss, just a quiet, persistent awareness that something is missing, and the particular exhaustion of not being able to name exactly what. Many Zillennials, without knowing this term, are living inside something that resembles it. They grieve, in small and unspoken ways, the analog childhood that ended before they were ready. They grieve the version of adulthood they were raised to expect and never received. They carry a millennial awareness of broken institutional promises without fully sharing the millennial cultural identity. They carry a Gen Z fluency with digital life and ironic distance without fully belonging to Gen Z's particular psychological landscape. What they are left with is a kind of permanent in-between-ness, not just culturally, psychologically, a self that was formed by two worlds at a time when those worlds were moving in opposite directions and that has spent the years since quietly negotiating the distance between them. And here is the part that almost nobody talks about. That negotiation is exhausting, not dramatically exhausting, not in ways that tend to get noticed or validated, but in the steady, quiet, cumulative way that all unacknowledged psychological labor tends to be exhausting. The kind that does not show up in any single moment, but accumulates across years, across conversations, across the small recurring experience of reaching for a shared reference point and finding that it belongs slightly more to someone else. Zillennials are fluent in millennial nostalgia. They can participate in the conversation about childhood cartoons, about dial-up internet, about growing up before social media, but they often feel like visitors to it rather than full citizens. They are fluent in Gen Z culture, the humor, the digital literacy, the emotional directness, but again, slightly translated, slightly performing rather than simply being. And the psychological cost of perpetual translation, of never being able to simply exist without the low-level awareness that you are slightly adjusting, slightly code-switching, slightly making yourself fit, is something that accumulates in ways that are hard to measure and harder to articulate. There is something else happening beneath all of this, something quieter, something that gets to the deeper psychological architecture of what it means to grow up without a clear generational home. Identity, in the psychological sense, is not just about knowing who you are, it is about having that identity reflected back to you, confirmed, recognized. When a generation shares a cultural story, shared music, shared humor, shared wounds, shared reference points, each individual member receives a kind of psychological mirror, a way of seeing themselves in others, a feeling that their experience makes sense within a larger frame.
Zillennials have two mirrors, both partial, both slightly distorted for them specifically. And growing up in front of partial mirrors, never quite seeing yourself fully reflected, leaves a very particular mark on how a person understands themselves. Not broken, not lost, but quietly, persistently unsure, in a way that most people around them never fully understood. Because nobody gave this experience a name. Nobody held up a mirror and said, "This is what you are carrying. This is why it feels the way it does." This is not a personal failing or a lack of clarity or an inability to simply decide who you are. This is what it costs to grow up between worlds. And what it built in you, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the in-betweenness, beneath the years of quiet negotiation, is something that most people on either side of you never had to develop. That is where this story goes next. There is a concept in developmental psychology called post-traumatic growth. It describes something that researchers began noticing in people who had been through significant adversity. Not just that they survived it, but that they came out the other side with capacities they did not have before. Greater empathy, greater flexibility, a tolerance for ambiguity that people who had never been tested in the same way simply did not possess. The research is careful to say that this is not a guarantee. Adversity does not automatically produce growth. What matters is whether the experience gets processed, whether it gets named, understood, integrated, or whether it simply gets carried, silently, as unexamined weight. This distinction matters enormously for Zillennials, because what they have been carrying, the in-betweenness, the dual identity, the exhaustion of perpetual translation, has for the most part never been named, never been placed inside a frame that said, "This is real. This has a shape. This is not a personal failing, but a generational experience with specific psychological contours." And what happens when something that has been unnamed finally receives a name is not a small thing. It is, in psychological terms, the beginning of integration, the beginning of the process by which a burden stops being just weight and starts becoming something you can actually look at, examine, and decide what to do with. So let us name it properly. Zillennials grew up translating. That is the most precise way to say it. Not translating between languages, between worlds. Between the millennial world that came before them and the Gen Z world that came after them. Between an analog past and a digital present. Between the institutional trust their parents modeled and the institutional skepticism the world taught them. Between the optimism they were given as children and the reality they encountered as adults. And translation, done constantly, over years, builds something. It builds what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously, to move between them without losing yourself, to understand a perspective without requiring it to be your own. This is not a small thing. In a world that is increasingly polarized, where the pressure to pick a side, to commit fully to one framework, to declare yourself unambiguously, the ability to stand in between without dissolving is genuinely rare. And Zillennials developed it not by choice, but by necessity, by years of having no other option. There is research from cross-cultural psychology showing that people who grow up between cultures, who are fluent in two worlds without fully belonging to either, develop particular strengths. They are better at perspective taking, better at navigating ambiguity, better at finding common ground between groups that do not understand each other. They carry a kind of double vision that people raised inside a single coherent cultural frame simply do not have. The experience of Zillennials is not identical to that, but the psychological structure is similar. Two worlds, two frameworks, two sets of references and values and ways of reading the room, and the capacity, built through years of quiet, unacknowledged practice, to move between them.
This is what the in-between built. Not despite the difficulty, because of it. But here is what needs to be said alongside that. And it needs to be said directly, without softening it into something more comfortable. The strength that the in-between built does not cancel the cost. Both are true at the same time. The exhaustion was real. The ambiguous grief was real. The experience of never quite seeing yourself fully reflected, of reaching for a shared identity and finding it slightly out of reach, that was real, and it left a mark. And that mark deserves acknowledgement, not as a wound to be nursed indefinitely, but as evidence of something that actually happened, as proof that the difficulty was not imagined, not performed, not a failure of resilience. It was structural. It was generational. It was the inevitable psychological consequence of coming of age at a specific intersection of history that nobody had a map for. One of the most consistent findings in psychological research on well-being is that validation, the simple experience of having your reality acknowledged by someone outside yourself, has measurable effects on mental health. Not because it changes the past, but because it changes the relationship to the past. Because it moves experience from the realm of private, unverifiable suspicion into the realm of shared, nameable reality. So if you are a Zillennial, or if you recognize this experience from someone close to you, this is the acknowledgement. The confusion was real. The in-between-ness was real. The exhaustion of holding two worlds without being claimed by either was real. You were not too sensitive. You were not failing to simply decide who you were. You were navigating something genuinely difficult, without a map, without a name for what you were doing, and largely without anyone around you who fully understood what it was costing. And the version of you that came out the other side of that, flexible, perceptive, capable of holding complexity in a world that increasingly struggles to, is not in spite of all of that. It is because of it. There's one more thing worth saying about identity, about what it means to build one in the absence of a clear cultural home. Psychologists who study identity development talk about two different paths. The first is identity foreclosure, adopting an identity that is handed to you by your culture, your family, your generation, without much examination. It feels stable because it is external. You do not have to build it. You simply step into it. The second path is harder. It is called identity achievement, and it involves doing the actual work of examining who you are, what you value, what you believe, independently of what the culture around you has decided you should be. It requires tolerating uncertainty for longer. It requires sitting with the discomfort of not yet knowing without rushing to a conclusion just because the uncertainty is uncomfortable. Zillennials, by circumstance, were pushed toward the second path, not because they chose it, but because the first path was never cleanly available to them. The cultural identity on offer was always slightly mismatched, and so, whether consciously or not, they had to build something of their own, from pieces of both worlds, from the analog past and the digital present, from the millennial awareness and the Gen Z fluency, from everything the in-between gave them. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the harder and more valuable things a person can do. If this video reached something in you, if it named something you have been carrying for a long time without quite having the words for, then do something for yourself right now. Subscribe to this channel, not because of an algorithm, not because it is what you are supposed to do at the end of a video, but because this channel exists for exactly this reason. To take the psychological experiences that go unnamed and unexamined and give them the shape and language they deserve. There is more here, more generations, more patterns, more of the quiet, important things that most people are carrying without knowing what to call them. Subscribe and stay. You have been between worlds long enough. You deserve a place that sees you clearly.